In 1968, teenage boys at a British institution were secretly given drugs to make them easier to control. Their parents never knew. The government approved it, and for nearly 50 years, nobody talked about it. Until BBC journalists found a dusty file in the National Archives that exposed everything. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is documented history. State-approved drug experiments on children who couldn't say no, couldn't leave, and had nowhere to run. The file number is BN29/2050. The title reads, Trial of Beclamide on Boys at Richmond Hill School. And what's inside will make you question everything you thought you knew about how governments treat the most vulnerable. Picture Britain in 1968. The Beatles are breaking up. Students are rioting in Paris. And in a remote-approved school in North Yorkshire, boys described as impulsive, explosive, irritable, restless and aggressive are being lined up for their daily dose of an experimental drug called Beclamide. They think it's medicine. It's actually a behavior modification experiment. These weren't regular schools. Approved schools were state-funded institutions where the government sent kids who had committed minor crimes or were considered beyond parental control. Think juvenile detention, but wrapped in the language of education and reform. Boys and girls as young as 10 could be locked away for years. No trial, no jury. Just a magistrate's signature and a one-way ticket to institutional life. The children at Richmond Hill weren't there by choice. They were wards of the state. And the state decided they needed to be chemically modified. Dr. Pamela Mason, a Home Office psychiatrist, backed the plan. Dr. J.R. Hawkins, the local psychiatrist, wrote the proposal. They framed it as therapy, but the real goal was crystal clear in their correspondence. Make these boys easier to manage. 6 months of daily Beclamide doses to turn down their aggression, their restlessness, their very personalities. Nobody asked the parents. Nobody needed to. The state had already taken custody of these children, and with it, the right to experiment on their developing brains. But Richmond Hill was just the beginning. At Springhead Park Approved School, another psychiatrist had an even more ambitious plan. Dr. Joyce Galbraith proposed dosing every single girl in the institution with haloperidol for 18 weeks. Not because they were sick, not because they had a medical condition, but to chemically settle the school. Haloperidol isn't aspirin. It's a powerful antipsychotic medication that can cause permanent neurological damage. And they wanted to give it to an entire school full of teenage girls for nearly 5 months. Mass medication as institutional policy. The only thing that stopped this plan was one person's conscience. Headmistress Sheila Sunner refused to allow it. She stood between the psychiatrists and an entire school full of vulnerable girls. Without her, history might have been very different. Before you continue watching, make sure you're subscribed to stay updated on more shocking historical revelations like this one. We uncover the stories they don't want you to know about. Now, you might wonder why anyone thought drugging children was acceptable. To understand that, you need to understand Britain in the 1960s. This was the era of pep pills, amphetamines that everyone from truck drivers to housewives used to get through their days. Pills were seen as miracle solutions to every problem. Can't sleep? Take a pill. Can't wake up? Take a different pill. Can't focus? There's a pill for that too. The same year these school experiments were running, Britain was in the middle of an amphetamine crisis. Millions of people were addicted to legally prescribed stimulants. The medical establishment was finally waking up to the dangers, calling for voluntary restrictions on prescribing. But old habits die hard. If pills could fix adults, why not use them to fix troublesome children? The difference was the drugs they chose. While adults were getting stimulants to make them more alert and energetic, the children got sedatives and antipsychotics to make them quiet and compliant. The message was clear. Adults deserve enhancement. Children need suppression. This wasn't happening in some rogue facility. These were official government programs with official approval. The Home Office, the same department responsible for national security and immigration today, was directly involved in planning and approving drug experiments on minors. Think about the ethics for a moment. In 1947, the world had established the Nuremberg Code in response to Nazi medical experiments. The code was clear. Voluntary consent is absolutely essential for any human experiment. In 1964, just 4 years before these British experiments, the Declaration of Helsinki reinforced this principle and specifically called for extra protection of vulnerable populations. Children in institutional custody hit every definition of vulnerable you can imagine. They're minors who can't legally consent. They're in state custody with no power to refuse. They can't leave if they want to stop participating. They have no advocates fighting for their rights. And yet, the British government decided their consent didn't matter. The official justification was behavior improvement, not medical treatment for diagnosed conditions, not emergency interventions to prevent harm, just making difficult children easier to handle. When you're dealing with kids who have already been failed by families, schools, and society, apparently the solution isn't better support or understanding. It's chemical suppression. The correspondence between officials reveals their true mindset. These weren't doctors trying to heal patients. These were managers trying to solve operational problems. Aggressive boys were a problem to be solved. Turbulent schools were institutions to be settled, and pharmaceuticals were the tools to do it. The drug they actually used was beclomide, an anticonvulsant normally given to people with epilepsy. But these boys didn't have epilepsy. They were getting it off-label for its sedative side effects. Imagine being a teenager in custody, told you're taking medicine to help you, while actually being used as a test subject for behavior modification. The haloperidol plan that was thankfully stopped would have been even worse. This is a powerful antipsychotic that can cause irreversible movement disorders. They wanted to give it to healthy teenage girls for 4.5 months just to make them more manageable. The potential for permanent neurological damage was real and documented. What we don't know is almost as troubling as what we do know. The publicly available documents don't tell us how many boys were actually given beclomide. We don't know the doses. We don't know what side effects they experienced. We don't know if any suffered lasting harm. The full details remain locked away in government files. This suggests a deliberate pattern of secrecy. When experiments are ethical and beneficial, researchers are usually eager to publish their results. When they're questionable, the results tend to disappear into classified archives. The fact that we're still missing crucial details nearly 60 years later tells you everything about how the authorities viewed these experiments. The story might have stayed buried forever, if not for investigative journalism. In 2016, BBC Radio 4's Today program reported on documents they had found in the National Archives. Suddenly, a story that had been hidden for nearly 50 years was front-page news across Britain. The Guardian, the Telegraph, the Independent, every major newspaper picked up the story. For the first time, the public learned that their government had approved secret drug trials on children in custody. The reaction was exactly what you'd expect: outrage, demands for accountability, and calls for full disclosure of what other experiments might still be hidden in government files. But here's what's really disturbing. The officials who approved these experiments weren't monsters hiding in shadows. They were respected professionals working within established systems. Dr. Mason was a government psychiatrist. Dr. Hawkins was a local medical authority. Dr. Galbraith was a trained specialist. These weren't rogue actors. They were the system working exactly as designed. This raises uncomfortable questions about how institutions treat vulnerable populations even today. When children are in state custody, whether in juvenile facilities, foster care, or residential treatment centers, who's watching out for their rights? Who ensures they're not being subjected to experimental treatments without proper consent? Who's checking the files that won't be opened for another 50 years? The boys at Richmond Hill had none of the protections that legitimate medical treatments provide. They were experimental subjects disguised as patients, given drugs to serve institutional convenience rather than their own well-being. The difference between legitimate treatment and human experimentation often comes down to consent, transparency, and who benefits from the intervention. Looking back, it's easy to condemn the officials who approved these experiments. But the real lesson isn't about individual moral failures. It's about systematic vulnerabilities that still exist today. Whenever you have powerless people in the custody of powerful institutions, the potential for abuse is enormous. The files that BBC journalists found in 2016 were just the ones that survived and were eventually made public. How many other experiments were conducted? How many files were destroyed or are still classified? How many children were used as test subjects in programs we'll never know about? What happened at Richmond Hill and what was planned at Springhead Park represents something deeper than isolated incidents of poor judgment. It shows how easily institutions can convince themselves that experimenting on vulnerable people is justified, ethical, and necessary. The language used by the officials involved is telling. They talked about improving behavior and settling the school. They framed chemical suppression as therapeutic intervention. They presented institutional convenience as medical necessity. These weren't accidents of language. They were deliberate attempts to make unethical experiments sound reasonable and caring. The boys who were given beclamide are in their 70s now, if they're still alive. They spent their childhoods in institutions, their teenage years as experimental subjects, and their adult lives probably never knowing they were part of secret government drug trials. Some might have struggled with unexplained health problems, never realizing they could be connected to experimental medications they received decades ago. The girls at Springhead Park who escaped the haloperidol experiment can thank one administrator's moral courage for potentially saving them from permanent neurological damage. But they also represent all the children who weren't so lucky, who were subjected to experimental treatments because no one in authority was willing to say no. The trail of documents that BBC journalists followed reveals a systematic approach to human experimentation on vulnerable populations. These weren't isolated incidents or rogue operations. They were approved programs with official paperwork, bureaucratic processes, and professional oversight. That systematic nature is what makes this story particularly chilling. It suggests that experimenting on powerless children was seen as normal, reasonable, and appropriate by the institutions responsible for protecting them. The same government departments that were supposed to safeguard vulnerable youth were instead using them as laboratory subjects. The fact that it took investigative journalists nearly 50 years to uncover these experiments shows how successfully they were hidden. If not for reporters digging through archive files, we might never have known about the boys at Richmond Hill or the girls who almost received mass doses of antipsychotics. This raises an obvious question. What other experiments are still hidden in government files? What other vulnerable populations were used as test subjects? What other therapeutic interventions were actually disguised human experiments? The beclamide trials might just be the tip of an iceberg we're only beginning to understand. Modern research ethics evolved partly in response to historical abuses like these. Today's standards for informed consent, independent oversight, and protection of vulnerable populations exist because people in positions of authority repeatedly demonstrated they couldn't be trusted to police themselves. But ethical standards are only as strong as the institutions enforcing them. When those same institutions have compelling reasons to cut corners or ignore inconvenient rules, vulnerable people are still at risk. Children in custody, elderly people in care facilities, prisoners, and others who can't effectively advocate for themselves remain potential targets for experimental treatments disguised as therapeutic interventions. The boys at Richmond Hill were told they were receiving medical treatment. They had no reason to suspect they were actually experimental subjects in a behavior modification trial. They trusted the adults in charge of their care, and that trust was systematically betrayed for institutional convenience. What's particularly disturbing about the Richmond Hill experiments is how thoroughly they were documented and approved through official channels. This wasn't some rogue doctor conducting secret experiments. It was a systematic program with bureaucratic oversight and professional approval. The banality of evil is often more frightening than dramatic villainy. The haloperidol plan that was stopped at Springhead Park shows how close these experiments came to causing massive, permanent harm. Haloperidol can cause tardive dyskinesia, a condition involving involuntary movements that can be irreversible even after stopping the medication. 18 weeks of doses to healthy teenage girls could have left dozens of young women with permanent neurological disabilities. The only thing that prevented this catastrophe was one administrator's refusal to cooperate. Sheila Sooner, the headmistress who blocked the haloperidol experiment, probably saved dozens of girls from lifelong suffering. Her courage stands in stark contrast to the institutional cowardice that enabled these experiments in the first place. But we shouldn't have to rely on individual heroes to protect vulnerable people from institutional abuse. Systems should be designed to prevent these experiments from being approved in the first place. The fact that it came down to one person's conscience shows how inadequate the safeguards really were. The documents that BBC journalists uncovered in 2016 represent just a fraction of what actually happened. The full scope of government-approved drug experiments on children in custody remains unknown. Files might be missing, destroyed, or still classified. Victims might not even know they were experimental subjects. The pattern revealed by the Richmond Hill and Springhead Park cases suggests these weren't isolated incidents. The casual way officials discussed drugging children for behavior management implies this was considered normal practice. If these two cases survived in accessible archives, how many others were lost or remain hidden? The boys at Richmond Hill deserved better from the adults entrusted with their care. They deserved honest information about their treatment, genuine concern for their well-being, and respect for their fundamental human dignity. Instead, they got experimental medications designed to make them easier to control. The girls at Springhead Park came within inches of a pharmaceutical disaster that could have destroyed dozens of lives. They were saved not by institutional safeguards or ethical oversight, but by one person's refusal to participate in mass medication of healthy children. These stories matter because they reveal how easily ethical standards can be abandoned when vulnerable people are involved. They show how institutions can convince themselves that harmful practices are actually beneficial when those practices serve institutional needs. The documents sitting in the National Archives aren't just historical curiosities. They're evidence of systematic human rights violations perpetrated by government institutions against children in their care. They're proof that the people trusted to protect vulnerable youth instead used them as experimental subjects. More importantly, they're a warning. The institutional structures that enabled these experiments still exist. The power imbalances that made them possible haven't disappeared. The vulnerable populations that were targeted then are still vulnerable now. The boys who were given beclamide and the girls who almost received haloperidol were failed by every adult and institution that was supposed to protect them. Their stories serve as a reminder of what can happen when we stop paying attention to how power is used against the powerless. But their stories also survived. 50 years later, we finally know what was done to them. And knowing means we can't pretend it didn't happen, can't ignore the implications, and can't assume it won't happen again unless we actively work to prevent it. The file number BN29/2050 contains more than historical documents. It contains evidence of what happens when institutions are allowed to operate without transparency, accountability, or genuine concern for the people in their care. And somewhere in other files, in other archives, other stories are waiting to be discovered.